I am so honored and so pleased to be able to welcome Patricia Albjerg Graham to speak to us today. Patricia, or Pat, is the Charles Warren Research Professor of the History of American Education Emerita, and she served as Dean of Hgse from 1982 to 1991.
Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you. It is really and truly wonderful to have you here. So to begin, I wonder if you might tell us, why did you want to become dean?
I wanted to become dean because I was very concerned about schools of education in the United States, and the major universities were getting rid of them. Harvard was thinking of getting rid of its, and I thought that if Harvard, which takes itself quite seriously as an eminent university, if it got rid of its school of education, that would be very bad for the study of education and the improvement of education in the United States. And so when President Derek Bok came to see me, I was in Washington as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center at the Smithsonian. He came to see me to ask me to become dean. I took me to lunch. He forgot his wallet, so I paid for the lunch, and then he reimbursed me subsequently.
Okay.
So we got off to a good start. And I said that I would be very happy to become dean if he would be willing to revisit the policy of not offering tenure to faculty at the ed school.
Yeah, so could you give a little more background on this? I don't think many people know this history.
Well, three of us got tenure at the ed school in 1974. Charles Willey, Robert Levine, and me. The three of us are an unlikely trio. And after that, I hope this was not causation, but after that, nobody got tenure. And so when he asked me to become dean in the fall of 1981, and ultimately I agreed, I said, I will only do this if you give me your word that you will revisit the tenure issue after I have had a little time to be there as dean. And he said he would. And I said, all I have is your word. But his word was good. And that was true not only in the tenure issue, but in other dealings with him as well. And it was sort of in the air that prestigious universities were getting rid of their schools of education. Duke, Yale, Chicago,
Right.
Stanford came within a whisker, and Berkeley nearly got rid of its. So right after I became dean, Derek Bok conferred with his pal, who was the president of Stanford, Don Kennedy, and they convened a conference of presidents and deans of schools of education, the ones that were still left, of about 6 or 8 universities. And we met and talked about whether major research universities ought to include schools of education. The argument was that schools of education aren't serious, they don't do good work, they're not academically eminent. Let somebody else do that. That was the argument against them. The argument for them was that if you want to have a society in which everybody is well educated, you need to figure out how to do that. And research universities have, generally speaking, had not been as interested in the problems of the poor, who are a very big group who are not well educated. They thought that was not their problem. They could have second-rate people take care of that. And my point, and Derek Bok's point, and Don Kennedy's point, was everybody in the society needs to be well educated, and we need the best minds we can find to help do that.
Right. It's amazing that how differently people were thinking at that point, that it was a controversy about what our role should be.
Well, if you think about major research universities, there's this status level among them. Mm-hmm. Some faculties in major universities are more prestigious than others. And schools of education were at the bottom. Well, I suppose schools of home economics were down there too. But most of these research universities didn't have schools of home economics anymore, if they'd ever had them.
So what were some of the first things you did to try to combat and advocate for the ed school?
I thought, well, the first and best thing I did was to hire Jerry Murphy as the associate dean. We met on July 1 at the Sheraton for breakfast. And so I knew Jerry, but I didn't know him terribly well. And so he says, well, he said, Pat, what's your plan? I said, well, Jerry, I don't have any plan. That's what you do. You plan.
Okay.
And he looked a little startled. And then we talked a little, and we knew that most of the senior faculty at the ed school was not primarily interested in schooling, particularly schooling of the poor. And if we were going to build the faculty, we had to build the faculty and convince the existing tenured faculty that the education of poor kids, many of whom were children of color, by no means all, but a lot were, and that those issues needed to figure in their work life at the ed school. And I had gone with a big yellow pad of paper to call on each of the senior faculty members in his, or in 2 cases, her office.
Okay.
And ask them what were their interests, what were they working on, what did they want the ed school to do. And I wrote all this down, by hand in those days. No tape recorders or anything like that. And then, of course, I studied them. And I looked for themes that would unite the faculty that we then had, who had been hired under very different assumptions about what a school of education should be, to see if we could weave that together with some of the junior faculty's interests into an institution that took the role of education in society seriously and recognized that the primary determinants of education for most children are their homes and their communities. But education is not the focus of the home or the community. The school is. So the school, together with home and community, needed to work more constructively, and how could we help do that?
So wasn't part of the controversy whether or not, as an education school, we should actually be in the business of training teachers? There seemed to be a divide between the research and actually practice.
Well, at that time, one of our most active faculty members, who subsequently moved to the business school, was Chris Hgse. And he was interested in how corporations train people. Well, I think that's an interesting question, but I don't think that's a question primarily for a school of education. And he was a brilliant man. So we did not move instantly into just looking at schooling, but we did move to further develop the Principal Center, which had been established a couple of years before, and we introduced, again, teacher training. But teacher training had been in the past principally for students who wanted to teach in the suburbs. We had a program with Newton, Massachusetts schools, which are excellent schools. And so I went calling on the superintendent in Cambridge Public Schools and to the superintendent in Boston Public Schools. The Cambridge superintendent said he'd never met anybody from Harvard before.
Oh, wow.
And the Boston superintendent said he was surprised that we were coming, and did we just want to put people in Boston Latin, which, of course, is an excellent school. I said, no. I said, we want to prepare people as teachers to work in schools with children who are not eligible for Boston Latin. Because I said, you'll get plenty of people who want to teach a Boston Latin. And when you're hiring new teachers are typically hired in schools which have high turnover of teachers, and Boston Latin is not one of those.
Right. Well, you actually created the first program at Hgse for undergraduates, the UTEP program, or Undergraduate Teacher Education Program. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, I believe that there are a lot of very bright kids who are undergraduates at Harvard, and we still don't know how to train teachers properly. But being a bright, enthusiastic learner yourself is one important quality for future teachers. And Harvard College is full of kids like that. Yes. And This was a very difficult moment because the faculty of the arts and sciences, on the whole, did not think that their precious students should go into public school teaching. And it turned out that UTEP became a very popular program with some of these students who thought they would try teaching for a while, see what they liked about it. This was a little different from Teach for America, which was quite popular at that time, because the people in UTEP actually did student teaching while they were seniors in college. And I had run a program like that at Barnard and Columbia, and for the New York City public schools, and as well as three private schools. And I thought these kids would be great, and many of them were.
Oh, that's fantastic. And that legacy continues with the UTEP and now the Harvard Teacher Fellows.
I think that's great.
Right. Trying to put in more innovation in what we have learned about how to prepare.
That's right. We know a lot more now than we did then.
Absolutely. But the undergraduates continue to be really interested in education, not only through teaching, but the education secondary.
Yes.
So that legacy lives on.
That's great. I'm really pleased.
Another thing you did, though, is you established the Urban Superintendent Program.
Right.
Which had a very distinguished history and helping to prepare leaders in districts all over the country. So why did you decide to embark on that?
Jerry Murphy and I thought that at Harvard we take leadership seriously. Well, I believe in leadership. And that we ought to be preparing people to do one of the toughest jobs in education, which is to be essentially a city superintendent. And we were fortunate in being able to recruit Bob Peterkin to come from Milwaukee, who had been in Boston and Cambridge before, to return and to provide the leadership for that program. And we've got some other excellent superintendents from around the country to help us out. Tom Pezant, who subsequently joined our faculty. Ray Cortines, who'd been in New York and San Francisco, Pasadena, Los Angeles. So we got some very good sitting superintendents to come and to help us. And that was a good thing. This was not something that our faculty was really prepared to do. And so the faculty expressed some reservations about their knowledge. And this was an opportunity for the faculty to engage in some learning on their own as well.
And it was a bit controversial as well. You decided to focus on urban districts.
Right, because that's where the poor kids are. And if you believe in the importance of education, you need to make sure that the youngsters who grow up in communities that are not wealthy and in families that do not have lots of extra discretionary income, you got to be very sure that their schools are good. And the reality is that often the schools that these children need the most are not the best schools, and we needed to figure out how to help them get better.
And again, another program that just had an amazing run and amazing alumni, which has then led to the EDLD program. So again, another thing that you did during your deanship.
Well, it wasn't me. It was Jerry and the senior faculty and the junior faculty, some of whom became the senior faculty when we could get to that.
Yes. So we're definitely going to talk about that, but definitely taking a lot of courage. But one thing I kind of glossed over is when Derek Bach appointed you, you were the first female dean to lead a Harvard faculty, the very first in 1982. So what was that like, to be the only woman sitting at the table?
I walked into one of these deans' meetings one time, and 3 or 4 of my colleagues as deans were standing together, sipping a little sherry before the lunch began, and they hadn't seen me come in. And these were very nice guys. And one of them said to his fellows, "Oh, it was so much easier when we were all alike." And I smiled and waited till they finished that conversation before I joined them.
Was it a constant thing that you felt?
Well, I was represented several things that Harvard did not value. I was a woman. I was in a school of education. I hadn't gone to Harvard. I had a strange maiden name, which when I came to the Radcliffe Institute, a member of the Radcliffe trustees said, "Oh, my dear," in a very gentle way, "why don't you just drop that Albjerg, my Danish father's name, and Patricia Graham would fit so much better."
Oh, goodness.
So I, of course, didn't drop it. But I was accustomed, by that time I became dean, to not fitting in entirely. And so I thought that was just the way the world worked, and you might as well get along with it and do the best you could and build on the strong foundation of the School of Education here, but make it a little more relevant to the problems that America faced in education.
Okay. And what was your reception like here at the Ed School? I imagine the students must have loved it. I'm wondering how the faculty responded.
Well, they didn't know me very well. Nobody knew me very well because I had been at Radcliffe as dean of the Radcliffe Institute for 3 years. And then when we achieved the merger of Radcliffe and Harvard, I left and went to the National Institute of Education in the U.S. government's Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. I went as director. And so when I came back here, I was teaching the history of education. And then I had a sabbatical. And so I was not very well known at the Ed School. I was, that woman, Pat somebody. And everybody here it was a very small faculty, and they all knew each other quite well. And the previous dean had done some remarkable things, but he was not wildly enthusiastic about the job that he was given here. And so it was a little between and beyond.
Okay. Was it what you expected?
Yes, because that's why I was so eager for Jerry to become the associate dean, because Jerry had been a graduate student here, had been through all this kind of turmoil and the various definitions and identities that the Ed School had from the time when it was under Frank Keppel, who was a legendary dean, Ted Sizer, who succeeded him, who had the bad luck to be here during the Harvard troubles of 1969, and then Paul Ildsacker, who in his own way was a fantastic and deeply honorable figure, but who was out of sorts with the administration. So that was complicated.
Yes. So much of the job is complicated. But you've spoken several times about working with Jerry Murphy, and Jerry also has wonderful things to say about you.
We had a good time.
You had a good time. So,
and he does some things vastly better than I do. And that, of course, was an enormous asset to me. First of all, he knew the place, which I did not know. And secondly, he is conscientious to the nth degree in planning and anticipating problems and being prepared. And he also has this fantastic sense of humor, which you certainly need in that job, as I'm sure you know, Bridget.
So you talked a little bit about how Derek came to meet with you to convince you to take the job. What was your working relationship like with him?
If he called me, I answered immediately, and I never called him.
Oh, really? Was the expectation that you were going to work on your own?
Yes. I mean, it was, I'm not even sure we sent our financial plan. I knew we could never run a deficit. And one year, our finance guy paid for the carpet on June 30th when he should have waited until July 1, and we ran a deficit for the carpet. But you were very much left on your own. But when we then were able to, the big decision to resume tenure appointments, then I saw Derek and I explained what the rationale was between the different appointments that we wanted to make and why I thought this was an appropriate rationale and why I thought these people should be appointed.
Well, kudos and thank you so much, because advocating for the school and making those appointments was so important in our history. You were actually able to secure 9 new tenured appointments.
They're great people.
Absolutely great people. But tell me more. So what's the secret? How did you do it?
Well, I was very fortunate in that when I had been at the National Institute of Education, which was the federal government's educational research agency, that had given me an opportunity to look around and see who was doing what. And therefore, I had that background, which I would not have had before. And then I also became president at the insistence of my old mentor, Larry Kremen, of the National Academy of Education. But I said I wouldn't do that unless there was an activity that the National Academy of Education could undertake to function, and that he was then president of the Spencer Foundation, and Spencer could fund that activity. Well, he said, "What's that activity?" He asked me this on the phone. Well, I mean, I was in bed. I don't know why I was in bed. I must have had a cold or something, and I'll never forget lying in bed and trying to come up with an activity that would justify the National Academy of Education and a project. And I said postdoctoral fellowships, because you get appointed as an assistant professor, you're overwhelmed with being an assistant professor, and you need to revise your thesis into a book or articles, depending on your subfield, and you don't have time. And then you don't get promoted to associate professor, and you have to, at that institution, you got to find another job. And so I thought the postdoctoral fellowship program was vital. So I gave a big pitch for postdoctoral fellowship.
Thank you. Thank you. As a beneficiary of that program years later. And so many of us here, thank you.
Well, it also meant that when we had the Academy did this, it was a way to see who the bright young faces were coming along. And you also would look to see who was writing the letters for them and who these people were. It gave you a wonderful introduction to who was doing what in research about education. And so when we were then making appointments, I was better prepared to know who was doing what where than I would have been without this National Academy of Education activity. And Gail Keeley, who ran it, was fabulous.
Yes. Gail, absolutely fabulous. I got to meet her and work with her a bit as well.
Sure. She did the work.
So did you have, though, a particular strategy? Were you looking for a certain kind of profile or particular areas where you wanted the school to expand?
Well, we had 3 areas at the school. One, human development. And when I came, we did not have a single person in human development who you could think of as an educational psychologist. We had some brilliant people, and we had, but they had left. Some of these educational psychologists. And it seemed to me if you were a school of education, you did need something in educational psychology. But it wasn't so much a strategy as it was that you needed to put together a faculty that was pleased to say they were working to understand and improve education, rather than they were saying that I am a historian. I'm an American historian.
Right.
Instead of saying, I'm a historian of education, a historian of American education. So that was, the faculty needed to believe that education was central to their activities. And they needed to recognize that schooling was an important part of education. This is not to take away from the greater influence of family and community. But schooling is what we could affect, and therefore they could not disdain schooling. And so as we thought about the new people who we would bring on to do that, that was the question.
So there's a long list of people. Could you mention just a few that you recruited and were able to bring to the faculty?
The first person we recruited to tenure was Kurt Fisher. And Kurt was a person whom the world believed was a very solid citizen, and he was not internal to the ed school. And it seemed very important that the first person we bring on would not be one of our own. The second person was Howard Gardner, who, of course, was and is, fortunately, one of our
Definitely.
own. Carol Gilligan, who was one of our own. Catherine Snow, who is one of our own. And as we went down the line, Eleanor Duckworth in the teaching and learning, which was an ill-defined area at the school. And she was doing work that was very different from anybody else. She actually worked with school teachers, and which was a novelty.
Oh, yes.
And then in the third area, administration, planning, and social policy, that was a little of this and a little of that. That's where I was. That was Jerry Murphy, and then Gary Orfield, and Richard Elmore. And then we also hired, before the tenure rule went through, Carol Weiss and Patricia Cross.
Okay.
But the first one, of course, was Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot.
Yes.
And that was what broke open the tenure rules. And we couldn't have started with anyone better than that.
So what was some of the most intriguing scholarship that was coming out of Hgse at the time?
Howard's Gardner's book, Frames of Mind, which talked about the many intelligences, was not a brand new idea, but certainly for most people who were not immersed in the history of education and British psychologists, it was brand new. And it certainly violated contemporary opinion about education. And so that we were very fortunate that came out just as Howard was getting tenure, because Howard had not been an assistant professor and associate professor. He'd been a research associate. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's work about different schools was very important, but I think probably what Sarah's work that was most gripping when it came out was the biography of her mother, who still lives, yes, believe it or not. And her mother was the first Black woman to be at the Columbia Medical School. It was a psychiatrist, was a practicing psychiatrist. In fact, some friends of ours, when we lived in New York, had her as a psychiatrist, and I heard about her mother before I met Sarah, and knew her father, who I was on the board with for a journal. So it's a remarkable family. Chris Argyris's work on organizations was extremely interesting. Jerry Murphy's work on how the Elementary and Secondary Education Act got passed, 1965, the first real federal aid to education, of which he had been a worker in Washington on the staff of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Johnson administration when that passed. That work. The person who taught really interesting classes, but who hadn't written much, was David Cohen. Oh. And of course, today we think of David Cohen as this writer who has written so much, but David wrote that after he left Harvard. But he taught that much of that while he was at Harvard, for which we were very fortunate. Catherine Snow's work on language development and on reading was profound. The person who was probably one of the best-known members of the faculty then was Carol Gilligan, who was giving women's issues an attention that nobody else had had in a series of essays. And, of course, she worked closely with her colleague, Lawrence Kohlberg, yes, whom they had known each other at University of Chicago. One of the great questions is, why did all these people from the University of Chicago show up here? And we certainly benefited from them.
Yes.
But that's primarily the work of the Sizer administration in recruiting most of them. Bob Levine, who came in 1974, was, of course, recruited by Ylvisaker. Bob Selman was in a group that was doing counseling psychology, and his subsequent work moved him into looking at the lives of adolescents in very important ways. I could go on and on, but I need to mention one person who left, And he left because we couldn't grant him tenure, and I urged him to accept the position at the University of Chicago. And that's Tony Breik.
Oh.
Tony was here as a brilliant assistant professor, became interested in issues of schooling, in part because he thought that was the way to stay, but we couldn't offer him tenure, and Chicago did. And the subsequent work that he did at Chicago, then at Stanford, and now as the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, where he is president, was all work that began working on a project for the National Academy of Education that Gail Keeley was overseeing.
What was some of the most intriguing scholarship going on at your time?
Well, the faculty was very imaginative, and that was a good thing. So let's take the Human Development Group. The Human Development Group was the one that Howard entered, and Howard entered with a bang, Howard Gardner, with his Frames of Mind, and then the many subsequent works he has done. But initially it was the Frames of Mind. Catherine Snow was there with her interest in reading, which supplemented Jean Shaw's traditional work in reading, which was legendary. Carol Gilligan was there talking about girls' interests and the morality issues for girls, supplementing what Lawrence Kohlberg, who had been interested in boys, had done. And they, of course, had been colleagues at the University of Chicago and were now colleagues here at Harvard. Kurt Fisher's work in reasoning and learning was central because we hadn't had anybody who was really interested in learning, who was permanently on the faculty. We had a lot of people who had been on the faculty, but not now. So that whole human development area, which was amalgamated to include Bob Selman, who had been in the clinical end, and we, to the great regret of many of us, particularly the people who were interested in counseling psychology, we eliminated that program because it brought us wonderful students, some of the best students we had. But when rules changed to get that accredited, would have cost so much, and that we could not do it, and we felt that it was inappropriate to spend money on counseling psychology, which were mostly people who were going to go out and be counselors to middle and upper class people. Mm-hmm. We were a school of education. Our primary business was to educate people, not to counsel them. Counseling is important, but that wasn't our primary activity. So that was a very controversial decision. But the work that was going on in teaching curriculum and learning environments, of course, the magnificent Israel Scheffler,
yes,
in philosophy of education, a joint appointee with the philosophy department, Eleanor Duckworth's magnificent work with teachers. Nobody else was working with actual teachers much. And then the work in the policy arena and the international work of Russ Davis, the international expert, a gruff ex-Marine, but who is legendary around the world in international education, with Noel McGinn. Jerry Murphy's work on the implementation of Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. David Cohen, who was fabulous as a teacher and an essayist, but hadn't written much. Since then, he went away to Michigan and he wrote Up the World. And now I'm happy to say he's back again.
Yes.
So that's excellent. We had, it took a little while for administration planning and social policy to sort of find its feet. Mm-hmm. And the Urban Superintendent's program really allowed it to do that. And we're indebted to the many who worked to make that happen.
Yes, yes. So how would you, during your time, describe the mission of the Ed School? And it sounds like it was really a period of transition.
We said that we needed to, as a school of education, we needed to think about what education ought to be, what the goal for education ought to be. Secondly, we needed to think about the institutions that were necessary to implement that goal. And finally, we needed to think about the schools themselves, as well as the colleges and the universities, that whose business they say is education, and how can we help them improve.
So you've said earlier just how the ed school was very much on its own. Certainly every tub on its own bottom was very, very clear during that period of time. But did you have many relationships with other deans or other schools at Harvard?
Socially, I knew most of these people. And President Bach was always eager for the schools to work together. But it would be fair to say that the School of Education was not every other school's first choice to work with. The point of view was that the School of Education was a trade school. They had teachers' colleges scattered around the United States that did what schools of education did. That's not what Harvard did. So institutionally, this was a little hard. And I also, of course, was the only woman, and there was not universal enthusiasm for that. But I was always treated politely, and I found that I was vastly better off if I talked individually to deans than if I tried to sell the School of Education. I thought they would come around, and to a very large degree they did. Bach sponsored dinner parties for the deans occasionally, and then he started dinner parties, separate dinner parties for the schools at Harvard that were least prestigious. Of course, the ed school fit right in there, along with public health and design and so on. But when U.S. News and World Report came out with its first review of schools of education, a category that I'm not wildly enthusiastic about. Nonetheless, it was very nice that the Harvard Graduate School of Education was number one. And that was the year after I left when Jerry was dean.
Okay. And did that impact, I wonder, the perspective of others?
Well, it did. It made, I think what made them notice was everybody at Harvard says they don't pay any attention to the rankings. Of course, no, we don't pay attention to the rankings. But, of course, they did. And at that time, there wasn't, I'm not sure I'm correct in this, but there weren't many other schools at Harvard that had been number one. Harvard as a university was number one, but the other schools, and the ed school held its number one position for quite a while.
Right. So you mentioned when you first became dean and you reached out to the superintendent of Cambridge and Boston, they were a little bit surprised to hear from you.
They were very surprised.
So how did your relationship, or the school's relationship, evolve over time with Cambridge and Boston?
Well, we worked at it. We worked hard at it. And Cambridge Seth did a great deal to foster those. And gradually, we got better relationships going. And people in those school systems found that we were not always the best at how to teach history or how to teach arithmetic or how to teach Spanish. Although we had some relationships with the Faculty of Arts and Sciences departments in foreign languages. But we were pretty good at broader administrative questions. Bob Keegan's work was particularly important to this. And then, of course, we started running active programs in professional education. We'd been doing IEM since 1969, which was higher ed and for people who wanted to be presidents or senior administrators of institutions.
And we're celebrating that anniversary now.
We are. And most importantly, I think, we did summer programs in which we took better advantage of our broader community of faculty and alumni and others in these programs in professional education, which Cliff Baden really did a remarkable job in setting up and making go. And sometimes we even made money.
Imagine that.
Imagine
Well,
that.
definitely, that's a legacy that has continued and has grown tremendously.
It's a good thing.
Your time as dean was a really important time for education schools as people were questioning whether or not they should even exist. But shortly after you became dean, this is also when A Nation at Risk, the report was released. So how did that report influence the conversation and what you were doing as dean?
Well, that report did not come as any surprise to me because the three key staff people who wrote it and worked on it, Milt Goldberg, Jim Harvey, Tommy Tomlinson, had all been staff at the National Institute of Education when I was director. I had hired Milt. Bob Schwartz was there too. So, and one of the members of two of the members of the commission, actually I knew, but one I knew really very well, who claimed principal authorship of some of the most poignant phrases. It was Jerry Holton, who was retired in the physics department, but had put together a high school curriculum in physics when he was a younger professor. So I think it was a shock to certainly to Jerry and for sure to Milt Goldberg that the report became so significant. They'd all like to think that they're working on a national report and it will be significant, but most of the time you work on a national report, it does not become significant. And this just hit at the right moment. And, the rhetoric was a little over the top on occasion, but of course that's sometimes what you need.
Right.
And it basically was not wildly false. The recognition that we needed to educate well a higher fraction of our population than we had educated was very important because we had often thought that, poor people don't need much of an education. Girls don't need much of an education. Well, you say poor people, girls, and much of the middle class really doesn't need much. You've taken care of a high fraction of the population.
Right.
And the thought had always been that Americans were ingenious and they could be bright, but those were qualities that didn't really need to be nurtured by a serious education. And what this report did, in my view, was to try to challenge that. And of course, they tried to challenge it. The reason for it was that the Secretary of Education, Terrell Bell, thought that the Department of Education, which just been established, was going to be killed under Reagan, eliminated. And so they had to make a sort of glorious case, and they did. Now, whether every phrase rings true today is a question we could discuss on another occasion. Right. But it certainly did bring attention to the problem, and attention needed to be brought.
Right. And did it change anything here closer to home on Appian Way?
No, because we'd already begun the changes. See, it came out in, if I'm not mistaken, 1974.
Well, there have been a series of
reports. We'd already been thinking about that. I mean, that's what Milt and Tommy and Jim and other people at NIE had been thinking of. Bob Schwartz had been thinking about already. And so when I came to the ed school, I was already thinking about that.
I wonder if it changed the perception of others and about the importance of education schools.
I don't think so. I think education schools are still thought to be in the lower tier of respect in most universities.
So you mentioned before, part of the mission at the time was thinking about what education should be.
Yes.
So when you think about education schools, what do you think, what role should education schools play?
Well, I don't think education schools have much role to play with the basics of families or communities. They're not leveraged to do that. It'd be nice if they were, but they're not. And we do not live in a society like the old Soviet Union or maybe Israel, in which the government thinks that it can create institutions in which children can be reared to be loyal to the government. So that's not the role for education schools. So education schools, in many ways, are playing with the third most important element in education, which is schools. And those are the only institutions which are primarily focused on education, because families are primarily focused on loving their children and nurturing them. And that is indeed appropriate. But in communities, of course, have many other things to think about besides opportunities for the young. But schools think about how children need to learn and believe and think.
Okay. So after leaving the deanship here at Hgse, you went on to be president of the Spencer Foundation.
That is true.
And so how did you continue your work and trying to improve education, or how did your deanship impact how you thought about being president of the Spencer Foundation?
Well, the president of the Spencer Foundation is supposed to think about what kind of educational research is best and how do we get people to do that. And I didn't think I could figure that out by myself. So what I tried to do with Spencer is similar to what I tried to do with the Ed School, which was to mobilize a community of scholars to figure out what best work is. So we had, at Spencer, we essentially had two kinds of programs: the fellowship program for young scholars, and then a very small program for senior scholars, and then a grants program, which we differed from past procedures at Spencer by having a committee of Spencer paid faculty at different places review the proposals rather than just Spencer itself.
Okay.
And when we thought about the future, that is the fellowship programs were the future, we also looked at schools of education, because frankly, many schools of education in the past did not do a great job. And I don't believe you ever went to one. Is that right?
No, I didn't.
And
this is my home, and this is the only education school I've been a part of.
But that is very common in the best schools of education, that you recruit your faculty from other disciplines where they have had an interest in education but not been part of the school. And one of the reasons is that when I was dean at Harvard and when I went to Spencer, there was only one graduate school of education in the country that we could find that supported their graduate students in the doctoral programs full-time, so that they could be graduate students full-time. That was Stanford, and it admitted about 35 students a year. Well, that's not enough. And so we established a research training grant program that provided fellowships to what we considered to be the leading schools of education, so that their graduate students who were going to be researchers could be full-time. Because I don't think you can learn how to be a researcher. Most people cannot learn how to be a researcher on a part-time basis. Right. You need to learn the culture of research.
It's incredibly difficult.
And that's hard.
Yes. So when you reflect back, what is the thing you're most proud of?
Oh, goodness. I hadn't thought of that. I'm pleased with the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I'm pleased that it's now considered appropriate to think about poor children's education, particularly poor children of color. I started out teaching poor white children, because I was in a segregated school system and I'm white. And poor children have tremendous disadvantages in this society, and education is one of the main ones. Their families are often wonderful, but the formal schooling that these children have is often lamentable. And if we can try to work on that, that seems to me very important.
So you've spent many decades now at Harvard.
Yes.
What do you think has changed the most at Hgse?
The color of the student body.
Really?
Harvard was one of the few places that trained blacks when nobody else trained blacks. And the old ACP program, Administrative Careers Program, had black students in it when practically nobody else did.
Okay. So even after you stepped down as dean and went to Spencer, you continued to teach at HGSE.
Yeah, I did.
And how did you enjoy that?
I loved it. I quit teaching the history of education after Julie Rubin came, and when I wanted to get out of the way of her having the experience that would allow her to get tenure. And so I was 2/3 at Spencer and 1/3 at Harvard. And the 1/3 I started teaching, which I enjoyed hugely. I don't know about the students, but I enjoyed hugely, was finding a researchable question. Because doctoral students, they have an abdominal urge, which they think is their question. Well, that's not enough. You need to be able to specify. Even historians know that,
yes.
And certainly economists do.
Yes.
But finding a researchable question that is something that can become a dissertation topic and dissertation research, and how it is you do that seemed to me something that they could use.
Yes, absolutely. It's very helpful for students. So as we celebrate our centennial, what do you hope for HGSE in the future?
To become even better than it is now.
That's great. And how would you describe HGSE in 3 words? Or a phrase?
Help good students. HGS.
Help good students.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.